Hello and welcome to Topic 11, Lecture 1, where we're going to be learning about sentencing and punishment. So, Chapter 11 serves as a segue or a transition between the topic about courts that we just completed and the final topic for the semester, which is corrections. And so, when it comes to sentencing and punishment, the sentence takes place in the courtroom. It is a function of the court system. And it's the judge who determines the sentence after the jury determines whether or not that person is guilty of the crimes they've been charged with. Once they're found guilty, then it's the judge that imposes the sentence. And the judge will take certain things into consideration when imposing that sentence. In a little bit, we're going to be talking about the sentencing guidelines that many states or all states have in place to sort of help move the judge in a particular direction in terms of what is considered a just and fair sentence. The prosecutor and the defense attorneys will both make recommendations to the judge for a sentence following a guilty verdict. And in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the death penalty. And in that case, the jury plays a role in determining whether or not the person who's found guilty of a capital offense, whether in fact they should be subject to the death penalty. And so keep that in mind. The jury doesn't normally play a role or generally play a role in sentencing, but they do when it comes to the death penalty. So that is the court. That's what, the courts play the role in determining the sentence. The punishment, though, is carried out by the correctional agencies, and that's what we're going to be learning in topic 12. And so if somebody is sentenced to probation or some sort of diversion program or at-home electronic monitoring, that punishment will be, implemented, or will be executed by the correctional, by some part of the Correctional Department of Corrections. The same is true with correctional institutions, jails and prison. So if somebody is confined, then that confinement is carried out by the correctional agencies, the jails and the prisons. And that the correctional agencies can actually impact the length of the sentence, particularly if you are confined to incarceration, incapacitation within a jail or a prison. Oftentimes that individual could be up for parole after good behavior. And it is the parole board, which is a part of the correctional agencies, that that they can, refuse somebody parole or they can grant parole. And so they can actually either lengthen or shorten the sentence, particularly if it's an indeterminate sentence, which we'll be learning about in a little bit. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first we're going to take a look at the goals of punishment. Next, we're going to take a look at the sentencing models that states use to determine the length of a sentence, indeterminate and determinate models. And then we're going to take a look at the factors that impact sentencing. So that's what we've got on the docket for this lecture. The next lecture, we're going to focus exclusively on the death penalty. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's take a look at the goals of punishment, the first topic we're going to be taking a look at in the lecture. Now, on April 20th, 2021, Derek Chauvin was convicted of 3 counts, including the unintentional second-degree murder for the killing of George Floyd. I think most of us are familiar with who Derek Chauvin is. And after he was convicted, about 2 months passed before he was actually sentenced for his crimes. And there was a lot of speculation about what kind of sentence he should receive and, really what is the message that's being communicated? Like, what is the goal of the punishment that he is going to receive? And so there was, consideration about what's the appropriate punishment for his actions. And to what we're talking about here is, what is the goal of the punishment that he receives? Is the goal to basically, set an example for other cops? And so maybe you would like to give him a pretty tough sentence. I think the minimum for the unintentional second-degree murder in Minnesota is 12 years. Should he get something a lot higher than 12 years? Because it basically it sets an example for other cops that if you engage in this kind of action, you're going to get a really stiff punishment. Is one of the goals to maybe give him a stiff punishment because you want to make him suffer for the harm that he's done to George Floyd and his family? Is he a danger to society? And that we should remove him, give him a long sentence to remove him from society because he is a dangerous individual. I mean, this was his first offense. He has not committed another crime, at least not one that he was charged with and convicted. And so, usually somebody who's a first offense, you could say, well, they don't really seem to pose a threat to society, and this happened during the course of his job. So maybe we might want to be more lenient in terms of the type of sentence he receives because he doesn't pose a broad threat. Well, all of these are the types of questions that are asked and answered sometimes with the sentence as it relates to what's the purpose of punishment? What is the goal that we're trying to achieve? There are several goals of punishment that are outlined in your textbook. They talk about general deterrence as being a goal of punishment, incapacitation, specific deterrence, restitution or just deserts, equity, restitution, rehabilitation, and diversion. And so let's take a look at each of these goals of punishment in more detail. So one goal of punishment is general deterrence, and that concept should be familiar to you because we talked about it earlier in this semester. To refresh your memory, deterrence is the idea of that you want to discourage a person from engaging in an action by instilling fear in them, fear of the consequences of if I engage in this action, this is what's going to happen. And so when you use the goal of general deterrence as a goal of the sentence or the punishment, the goal is that people should be punished in order to set an example for others. Because remember, general deterrence is basically trying to deter others from engaging in that behavior. And so, for example, if Derek Chauvin receives a really harsh punishment, right, like really long prison sentence, and if the goal is and the reason that he gets that harsh punishment is the goal being general deterrence, the reason that he would receive that harsh punishment is because they want. The goal is to deter other cops from engaging in that behavior. So like a message is sent to other cops. Now the flip side of that is specific deterrence. And again, this is a concept that we talked about earlier in the semester. If the goal of a sentence or punishment is specific deterrence, then basically the goal is saying that the personal experience of suffering a harsh punishment should inhibit future law violations for the offenders. Basically putting that another way, that you give the offender a harsh punishment because you don't want that offender to engage in that behavior again. And so if you give a harsh punishment to Chauvin and the goal is specific deterrence, that you would give that harsh punishment because you want to ensure or you want to at least sort of inhibit Derek Chauvin from engaging in that behavior in the future. Okay. Now that's not likely to be a goal for Chauvin. Maybe it is, just because after getting convicted of this as a police officer, the chances of him serving on a police force again is probably slim to none. However, I guess it could, make him think twice about engaging in some sort of thoughtless, violent action as he engaged in with George Floyd. So it could be a potential goal of any sentence that he received. Another goal of sentencing is incapacitation. And the idea of incapacitation, incapacitation is just taking away somebody's liberty to move, right? And the idea is that the person that committed the offense and found guilty is seen to pose such a great danger to society that they need to be removed from society. And the goal of incapacitation is to keep society safe. The goal is to prevent crime by keeping offenders, in particular violent defenders, under state control. Now, that's likely to be a goal in the sentencing of Darrell Brooks, the alleged perpetrator of the violence at the Waukesha Christmas parade. This last about a week ago. It's probably a goal because Darrell Brooks, if he is found guilty, he has a long history of engaging in violent behavior. In particular, he's used cars in the past in order to hurt people. And the state very well may think boy, with a long criminal record and similar behavior, that the state just really needs to keep this dangerous person out of society. Now, for some offenders, maybe Darrell Brooks, but, definitely some violent offenders, incapacitation makes a lot of sense, right? That they're just too violent to be left in society. But it does have consequences, and, they, in the book that you read, Locked In, that, the author talks a lot about the consequences of long-term incarceration or incapacitation for violent offenders. For one, removal from society is costly. It's costly both in terms of money, but it costs a lot, and we're going to be learning about this in the next chapter. It costs a lot of money to keep people behind bars, but it also has a social cost as well, right? That it impacts families and it impacts communities when people are taken out of society. Also, the Locked In talks about that many violent offenders sort of age out of violence, right? And so that you commit a violent offense early in your life, right? In your late teens, early 20s, but then you get this very long sentence. And initially it makes sense to have that person incapacitated. But as they, are 40, 50, 60, the chances or the probability of that individual engaging in the same level of violence it diminishes. And so, but the cost is that they're no longer a threat, no longer maybe needing to be incapacitated, but they are in fact still incapacitated, leading to this higher cost. Another goal of punishment or sentencing is retribution or just desserts. And basically, when you sentence somebody with this goal in mind, you're basically saying that the criminal is punished simply because they deserve to be disciplined for what they did. In other words, that they're getting what they deserve. And this is often a justification, or one of the justifications that is used for the death penalty. That the idea that if you take somebody's life, then we're going to take your life because you get what you deserve. Murderers should be killed, an eye for an eye. I was thinking about retribution, just desserts when it came to the alleged perpetrator of the parade attack, Darrell Brooks. And I mean, I'm sure that is going to be a goal in the sentencing that he receives. He's been right now charged with 5, if not 6 counts, or will be charged with 5 to 6 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. And we don't have the death penalty in Wisconsin, but each of those charges, if found guilty, come with a life sentence. And I think that a lot of people say that he would get what's coming to him, right? That's it. That's a heinous attack, and you got what you deserve. But I was, I watched when his first appearance in court, and he just hung his head as he was hearing, the initial information, and he hung his head and he was just weeping the entire time. And I read a little bit about his background, and I just sort of wondered, is that really what he deserves? We talked earlier in the semester about, is a person like this to blame? He's a chronic offender. He has a history of mental illness. He has a history of anger issues. And sure, not that he doesn't have some responsibility or a lot of responsibility for his actions. But watching him and thinking about him, I was sort of thinking about that in a way maybe society failed him as well, because, he should have been treated or at least given tools in order to not engage in these kinds of behaviors from society, maybe rehabilitated. But I'm fairly certain that the just desert will be a goal of the punishment for Darrell Brooks. Another goal of punishment is equity or restitution. And the thinking behind this the goal of this type of punishment is that the criminal should pay for the cost of the harm that they have done. And so, in other words, that the goal of equity restitution is that the criminal must pay back their victims for their loss. They also need to pay back to the criminal justice system and to society for the costs associated with their criminal actions. I'm going to use the example of Purdue Pharma. In 2020, Purdue Pharma, that is the corporation that's responsible for the production and distribution of OxyContin, which led to the opioid crisis in the United States. and resulted in many addictions and deaths. They pled guilty to criminal charges, including conspiracy to defraud the United States, because they, basically said that their drug wasn't addictive, when in fact they very well knew that it was addictive. And so they pled guilty, and they also were forced to pay over $4 billion in criminal fines, and that those fines will be used to basically hopefully repair the cost that is associated with their actions, being used for given to states so that they can help with developing addiction clinics and those sorts of things. So it's kind of an example of equity restitution. Rehabilitation, the goal is that the justice system is obligated to treat the sick, the unfortunate people. Criminals are sick. There's something wrong with them. They need treatment, and they shouldn't just be punished for their misdeeds. So obviously the goal of rehabilitation is treatment. The example I'm going to use here is Anissa Weir from the Slenderman case, that she was sentenced to, she was found not guilty due to a mental disease or defect, she was still sentenced to be confined at a mental health hospital, and could only be released until when she could demonstrate that she had been treated, right? And she was recently released because that the evidence that now at 19, she, had been helped, that she was able to recover from her mental health issues, and she was ready to join society again. So sort of a contemporary example of the goal of rehabilitation. And the final goal of punishment that we're going to take a look at is diversion. And so the goal of diversion is really sparing a non-dangerous offender from the stigma and labeling of a criminal conviction, and preventing them from having any future or further involvement with the justice process. So an example of that, of a diversion sentence, is that you plead guilty oftentimes to your crime, and then you're sentenced to required counseling or community service. And then once you satisfy the requirements to receive counseling and community service, that the charges are either dismissed, or if you plead guilty, that the guilty plea is dismissed and erased from your record. Okay. And so that can be a goal. You can basically say that that particularly for nonviolent or non-dangerous offenders, that they don't really, the best way to handle this is to get them some treatment, not put them in behind bars, let them prove that they can satisfy their treatment requirements, and then this will then prevent them. The goal is to prevent them from having future involvement with the justice process, with criminal justice process. We learned earlier in the semester about the non-interventionist perspective. This idea is that more contact with the criminal justice system is oftentimes harmful, and so the goal of diversion is to prevent that future harm that's associated with continual involvement with the criminal justice system. Okay, so we've gone over the goals of punishment, and I just want to let you know that when our final exam comes in a few weeks, one of the questions on the final exam will be that you'll be given a case and somebody who is found guilty, and then you're going to be the sentencing judge, and that you are going to give this person a sentence, and that you will have to basically describe the sentence that you're going to give, and that you're going to talk, and I'll ask you to say what are two of the goals that you hope to achieve with the sentence. And so you'll have an opportunity to choose from those goals we just talked about and apply them and explain how these two goals that you select are goals that you hope to achieve with the sentence that you're going to give this person in the hypothetical case. The next thing we're going to talk about is sentencing models. And those who are convicted of crimes are sentenced in the United States by two major models. One is known as the Indeterminate Sentencing model, and the other is the Determinate Sentencing model. And, the difference between the indeterminate and determinate, just think about those words, right? For example, let's say I asked you the question of, hey, what are you going to be doing this weekend, right? This coming weekend? What do you plan to do? And you say, well, I'm not sure. There's many things that we could do. it has not yet been determined what we're going to do. Our plans are indeterminate, right? And that means that your plans are sort of undefined. It's not actually exactly known. And that's what an indeterminate sentence is, that the sentence itself is sort of undefined. We don't know exactly how long the sentence will be. And in a second, I'll give you some concrete examples. A determinate sentence is a sentence that's known, it's established, it's defined. And so, for example, if I asked you, hey, what are you going to do next weekend? And you were like, we're going to go see Dune, right? I saw it. It's really good, right? Going to go see Dune. So excited. That's what I'm doing on Friday. Well, your Friday plans are determined, right? You have a determinate plan for Friday. And so a determinate sentence is a sentence that is known. It's defined. The model that's used is determined by law. And so, as we know, the federal government sentences people for federal crimes, but states sentence people for the state crimes that they commit. And depending on what state you use or state you live in, the state law determines what model is used. So Wisconsin uses a determinate model. Our sentencing model is determinate. We'll talk about it in more detail in a second. But most states use an indeterminate model. 34 states use an indeterminate model. So let's look at these two sentencing models, and then we'll talk about sort of the benefits and the drawbacks of each. Okay, let's talk about indeterminate sentences. So an indeterminate sentence is undefined. The sentence is within a particular range. So an example of an indeterminate sentence would say that a person is sentenced to secure confinement in prison for no less than 5 years, but not to exceed 15 years. So the sentence is secure confinement between 5 and 15 years. That's an example of an indeterminate sentence. And the goal of indeterminate sentencing is that you place an offender in confinement only until they are treated, rehabilitated, and then they can be released on parole, and they can enter back into society, right? So indeterminate sentencing sort of holds out this hope that sentencing can be used as sort of a motivator for people to rehabilitate themselves, make the right choices while in prison so that they can get back into society. Indeterminate sentences, the benefits of this type of sentencing is that it incentivizes good behavior. It incentivizes rehabilitation because if you want to get out closer to 5 years, that you better behave yourself in prison, and you also must demonstrate that you're really trying to improve yourself through learning a skill or by taking treatment courses within prison, so that you're sort of demonstrating that in fact you have been rehabilitated. And so you'd rather be there closer to 5 than 15, and so the thinking is that you're going to engage in those sorts of behaviors. Indeterminate sentencing also it uses more of correctional agents and parole agents within the sentencing, so not in giving the sentencing, but determining the length of the sentence. And so correctional agents and parole agents, play a role in the sentence. In other words, that, after your 5 years, then you would go before a parole board and you would make a case that you have demonstrated good behavior, you've demonstrated rehabilitation, and then the parole board will make a decision about whether you will be released. So the correctional agents play a role in the length of the sentence. The downside of it is, so the benefits are that it incentivizes good behavior and rehabilitation. But the downsides is that there's lack of clarity and oftentimes in terms of why parole is denied. That you may be doing all of the right things and you still may not get your parole granted. And many who are subject to indeterminate sentences tend to get really frustrated and kind of like hopeless, because they're like, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, yet they still will not grant me parole. And so it sort of makes almost a mockery of this promise of indeterminate sentencing. Improve yourself, demonstrate that you're rehabilitated, and you will be released. And that can be pretty frustrating if you don't get released. Okay, so what about determinate sentences? Well, a determinate sentence is a fixed term of years to be served by the offender. The sentence has a clearly defined number of years. So an example would be that a person is sentenced to secure confinement in prison for 15 years. That is a determinate sentence. Now, Wisconsin uses determinate determinate sentencing. And so as of 2000, it says there Wisconsin has truth in sentencing. And what that means is that anybody who is sentenced after the year 2000, that they are required to serve the entire length of their what's known as a bifurcated sentence, their entire length of incarceration, and also their entire sentence of extended supervision. So oftentimes when people are sentenced in Wisconsin, they'll have a sentence to 5 years in incarceration, and then an additional 3 years in extended supervision after they are released. And with our truth in sentencing, people serve that entire period of time in general. There are some exceptions. The benefit of determinate sentencing is equal justice, that people who commit the same, there's a better chance in a determinate sentencing structure that a person who is sentenced to 15 years will serve the entire 15 years. In an indeterminate sentence, somebody who is sentenced to 5 to 15 years for a crime, and the other person is also sentenced to 5 to 15 years. Well, one person might get 5 years, the other person might get 10 years, right? And it seems like, well, is that really equal justice, right? That if you engaged in this offense, you should get your sentence and you should serve your sentence. And also that it provides both some assurance to the victim and the community because they know the length of the sentence. So if you're a victim and you know your offender has been given a determinate sentence, they're going to serve that. You don't have to be like, are they going to get out at 5 years? Do I have to check back at 6 years, 7 years, right? You know that they're most likely going to serve the full 15 or whatever their determinate sentence is. The downside of it is that there's no incentive for good behavior, right? I mean, it's like if you're there for 15 years, no matter what, then why behave, right? Although I guess if you act out and misbehave in prison, that years could be added on to your sentence. So there is some incentive. But it's probably a stronger incentive to say, hey, you can get out earlier if you behave well and also participate in some rehabilitation programs. Well, so which is the better sentencing model? Well, it's up for debate. It's a reflection of values, right? If you think that, people should be given a sentence and they should serve that sentence that they're given, that there's some truth in that sentencing, that you think that it's better for victims, you might support determinant. If you think that, hey, it should be in a range to incentivize good behavior, you might be more supportive of indeterminate sentencing. Now, let's say if you were sentenced, though, which would you prefer? Would you prefer an indeterminate or a determinate sentence? Would you rather have a range and try to modify your behavior so that you get out sooner? There's a benefit to that, but what if you're doing all the right things and you don't get out? You could get kind of frustrated. Or would you just say, you know what, I'm here for 15 years, I'm going to have to deal with it, and there's no promise of this carrot of early release that actually may never be realized. If you were a victim of crime, which would you prefer for the offender? It seems like you would prefer determinate, right? Because you'd be like, I know when they're in there and I know when they're going to get out. But maybe you believe in rehabilitation, and maybe you feel like if the sentence is incentivized to think about what you did and what you did was wrong and kind of improve yourself and have that reflected in your behavior, perhaps a victim of crime would support an indeterminate sentence. And so if the goal of sentencing is X, which model do you think is more able to achieve the goal? This is something else. Again, questions like these will be on the it will be on the final exam. If the goal is incapacitation, then would you want determinate or indeterminate sentences? There's no right answer. I'll leave that up to you. If the goal of the sentence is general deterrence, sending a message to others, don't engage in this, do you want an indeterminate or determinate sentence? Retribution, just desserts, restitution, diversion, etc. Which sentencing model would you advocate for based on the goals of what you hope to achieve with your sentence? Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is the factors that affect sentencing. Now, state, and you'll read in your textbook about how state and federal governments have sentencing guidelines. Wisconsin has them, and prosecutors and defense attorneys look at the sentencing guidelines. Once somebody is convicted, they'll look at the sentencing guidelines, and the sentencing guidelines will give guidance to the prosecutor, to the defense attorney, to the judge. It gives you a standard that defines the parameters of the sentencing decision. So you'll read more about that in the textbook. So sentencing guidelines are used to provide some uniformity in terms of the kinds of sentences that people receive for the crimes that they have committed. The judge, when imparting a sentence, can consider certain factors when sentencing. They can look at the severity of the offense, the offender's prior criminal record. Are they a repeat offender? Whether violence or excessive violence was used in the commission of this crime, whether and what type of weapons the offender used, whether the crime was committed for money. These are all allowable factors that a judge can take into consideration when sentencing somebody for their crime. Judges cannot consider race or gender when sentencing someone. Okay, so you can't say, "Hey, this person's white," or "This person's a woman," or "This person's a black person, that I'm going to give them this sentence." That's against the law. That violates the Equal Protection Clause. However, we learned from the book that you read, Locked In, that there's evidence of racial bias, not so much in sentencing, but in the way that the prosecutorial discretion. We do know that when you look at aggregate data, that African Americans are more likely, that prosecutors are more likely to sentence or to charge an African American with an offense that carries a mandatory minimum sentence than a white person, right? And so there are decisions that the prosecutor makes that can impact sentencing, and there's racial bias there. You read about it in Locked In, but overt sort of taking race and gender into consideration is not allowed when it comes to sentencing. So let's conclude with returning to Derek Chauvin and the sentence that he received, and whether or not you think it was the correct sentence. Chauvin was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison for being found guilty of unintentional second-degree murder. It is the stiffest penalty that any law enforcement individual has ever received in the state of Minnesota, if not throughout the United States. It was well above the minimum guidelines. So the Minnesota guidelines said that the minimum sentence for that crime was 12 years. But the prosecutors asked for 30 years. That was their recommendation. And so the sentence that he received was less than the prosecution's recommendation. And so also Minnesota has a somewhat of an indeterminate sentence model that he received 22 and a half years in prison. So that was determined. However, they have a good behavior policy. And so that if Chauvin exercises good behavior after he serves 2/3 of his sentence, he's eligible for early release. So he could be released as early as 15 years if he has good behavior. There were factors that were considered when Chauvin received the sentence. It was his first time offense, so I'm sure that that's why the judge did not go to the maximum, which was 40 years. However, there were aggravating factors. The fact that it was, for so long his knee was on George Floyd's neck, that this was committed in front of younger people on the streets. That there seemed to be like a heinous level of this crime in terms of the violence that was used. Those were things that were reported as affecting the sentence that he received. It was also sort of uncharted territory, that there's not a lot of examples that the judge could use in terms of what kind of sentence should he receive, because very few officers are found guilty of homicide. And so, the sentence was, there weren't a lot of precedents to guide the judge on this. So the question is this the correct sentence? Something to think about, and also based on what we learned about in this lecture, what are the goals of this sentence? Is it general deterrence to send a message to other cops? Is it just desserts? Is it rehabilitation? What are some of the goals? All right, thanks for your attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.